Welcome everybody. It's great to see it packed out. Thank you very much for coming. So this is one of the economic solution debates. Can the UK economy survive Brexit? And I think we can probably safely say that it should also be, can the UK economy thrive with Brexit rather than just survive? That's up for debate as well. Just a reminder that Brexit is from the EU, not from Europe, so I hope we can keep the terms straight. We are one speaker short at the moment. The debate is sponsored by Vodafone, which we're very grateful for them doing that. And in fact, the speaker is from Vodafone, so I'm particularly hoping he's going to come along and tell us the relevant parts of that. So on my immediate left is Baroness Faulkner, who is a Lib Dem peer and chair of the House of Lords EU Financial Affairs Subcommittee. I think you are also spokesman on foreign affairs for the Lib Dems in the Lords. Is that correct?
Right. That's right.
On her left, Thomas Kielinger, who's the UK correspondent of Die Welt. And on my immediate right is Philippe Legrain, who is visiting senior fellow of the LSE's European Institute and has written a number of books, one of which is European Spring, Why Our Economics and Politics Are in a Mess and How to Put Them Right. On his right is Phil Mullen, who's an economist and director of Epping Consultant Business Advice. The order in which they're going to speak is Philippe and then Kirshwa and then Phil and Thomas.
Can the UK economy survive Brexit? And the answer is, of course, yes, it can. I think the better question is, would Britain be better off economically or worse off economically outside the EU? And I think that we're better off staying in than leaving. That's because membership of the EU provides Britain with really quite substantial economic benefits. The first, of course, is free trade within the single market. Nearly half of our trade is with the EU. And in goods, it's completely free, and in services, some of it's free and some of it's less free. Secondly, foreign direct investment. Lots of companies invest in Britain, partly because of the skills of the people who work here, partly because we've got, a good legal system and all sorts of other advantages, but also partly because we're a member of the EU, and if you invest here, you can export freely across the EU. And so you look at, for example, the British car industry, which died. Now there is a foreign-owned car industry, which employs lots of people in skilled jobs. Most of the cars that are produced are exported to the EU. The third thing, Britain is a relatively small economy globally, 3.5% of the world economy, and that's obviously going to carry on shrinking year by year as China, India, and other countries catch up. But within the EU, it's a relatively big player, especially when it's operating in alliances with like-minded countries like the Netherlands or Sweden or Denmark. It has a say in shaping the rules of the EU, and both the specific rules and the broad direction of the EU. And you can see that basically the EU has changed in a kind of British kind of direction since we joined more than 40 years ago. Following on from that is the clout that you have from being part of a big club in global negotiations. Earlier in my career, I worked at the World Trade Organization, and I know firsthand how a big player like the United States negotiates with small countries. They go in there and say, this is what we want, take it or leave it. If you're negotiating as part of the EU, you can say, no, that's not acceptable, this is what we want. And you can see on a whole host of issues that the EU and the US negotiate as equals. If the EU says that a merger can't go through, it doesn't go. A merger of American companies can't go through, it doesn't go through. If the EU says US companies aren't respecting the privacy of Europeans' data, then American companies need to comply with that. A small country on its own would not have that clout. And you can see that really firsthand, for example, in the extradition treaty which the US concluded with the UK under the previous Labour government, which was completely one-sided, even though ostensibly we're great friends and partners, because the big power dominates the small power. And in another previous job as economic advisor to the President of the European Commission, I visited China quite a bit. And the Chinese were generally pretty disparaging about Europe. It's your history, we're the future, you're the past. Particularly disparaging about bits of Europe. And, the idea that somehow one relatively small bit of the world called Britain would have influence in Beijing, or more influence in Beijing outside the EU, I think is fanciful. That brings me to the last big economic benefit of the EU, which is probably the most controversial, which is the free movement of people. I think it's fantastically advantageous both for British people to be able to work anywhere in the EU, and it's also fantastically advantageous that Britain is open to people from Spain, Portugal, Germany, Poland, other European countries who come here and do jobs that need doing, who pay more taxes than they take out in benefits, generally contribute to the economy and to society. Those are the benefits of the EU. Set against that, there are a number of costs. First of all, there is the membership of the club. You have to pay a fee for that. Britain's net contribution is £8.4 billion a year, which is a lot of money, but it's £130 per person. It's a bit more than the price of the ticket to attend this weekend. But in exchange for the price of that ticket, you get all the benefits that I've just mentioned. It's about 0.5% of UK GDP. Another cost is the common agricultural policy. Basically farm subsidies and tariffs, which means that we have higher food prices than otherwise. Basically, they're subsidies to big landowners. They're particularly harmful to people in poor countries who can't export to Britain and Europe as they otherwise might be able to. Whether they would disappear if we left the EU, I'm pretty sceptical. We had farm subsidies before we joined the EU, and if you think of the influence that big landowners have over the Conservative Party, and if you think about the eco-romantic wing of the Labour Party, I probably think we would end up with farm subsidies even if we left. Last but not least is the idea that there are a whole host of regulations which the EU imposes which would be lower if we left. In most cases, the regulations actually provide benefits as well as costs. The worst regulations that exist in Britain are actually enacted here by the British government, if you think of planning restrictions and stuff like that. If you look overall, according to the OECD, Britain has among the least regulated labour and product markets in the EU. So the notion that they are higher as a result of the EU, I find unconvincing. Let me just conclude by saying, of course, we don't know what arrangement would exist if Britain was to leave. I think it's hard to argue that our relationship with Europe would be on better terms than it is now. We have a fantastic deal where we are opting out of the euro, opting out of things that we don't like, and still full members economically and benefiting in that way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philippe. Kishore.
The question, I think, is slightly difficult because it implies that you should trust economics. And for those of you who still have recollection of the financial crisis of only 7 years ago, where the Queen asked at LSE the famous question of the economists that had been assembled there, why didn't any of you see this coming, makes me suggest that it's profoundly about more than just economics. It's a political judgment, and what the political judgment is about our appetite for risk. To what extent are we prepared to take a leap in the somewhat dark, and no amount of reports that will come out between now and when that referendum happens will be sufficient to really explain what will happen afterwards, because a counterfactual, we cannot know. We know what membership means. We've been there for about 50 years. We don't know what non-membership means, because the only two examples there are, Norway and Switzerland, are both so different to us. Norway has a population of about 5 million. Switzerland has a population of about 8 million. Norway is oil-rich, so its economy is hugely affected by its sovereign wealth fund and the choices it makes as such. Switzerland has a completely different economic model, economic and constitutional model, that affects it hugely. There is no blueprint. This is a tabula rasa. One thing that we do know is that Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, on which our Brexit, were it to happen, would be predicated, is a take-it-or-leave-it article. It doesn't provide for any kind of negotiation. All it does is give us a steer that it expects negotiations to be complete within 2 years. 2 years is a really short time frame when you're disentangling 50 years of law. So the question comes, is the UK so different from the rest of the EU, that Brexit would be good for us. And this is where I think we have most level of consensus among the economists, to the extent that there is one. Philippe talked about the budget and the budget contribution. We know that the two countries, the models that we know, Norway and Switzerland, which are out, still make huge contributions to the budget, to the EU, even though they are out. In Norway's case, it's around 90% of per capita, and Switzerland's case is about 45% per capita. So in terms of savings that we will get if we leave, there won't be very much change left from savings. But the savings that we have assume at the moment that maybe we will save some money. The costs of Brexit, as again Philippe mentioned, would depend on several other intangibles, single market membership or a free trade agreement. Norway has membership of the single market. Switzerland doesn't. And they have very different experiences. If you talk to politicians in both countries, they implore you not to go in their direction because they pay for the price for not being at the table while decisions are imposed on them. We could have no free trade agreement whatsoever and negotiate them independently. Well, those are extremely hard to do, not just in the case of the example that Philippe gave, but we know that TTIP is looming in front of us, Transatlantic Trade and Agreement Partnership. Of course, that won't depend. I mean, the idea that the UK could have some sort of agreement with the US when you have this comprehensive thing in front of us is, I think, slightly optimistic. In fact, whether TTIP goes ahead in terms of the EU or not depends really on whether Hillary Clinton gets elected to the White House, because she's now said she's decidedly against it. I can't see that it's really clear to us that membership of the EU is a hindrance to international trade, but I'll leave that to Philippe to come back with, and perhaps we'll pick it up in other questions. The one single point you should be aware of is that when Eurosceptics tell you that we would strike all these trade agreements, that we could enhance our trade with the rest of the world, ask them why Germany has 4 times the amount of trade with China that we do, despite the fact that we had Hong Kong and we have historical links to China. So the reason that they have higher trade with China, for example, than we do, I think has more to do with the state of our economy, the state of our skills, the things we produce, rather than a simple equation that the EU holds us back from having trade with China. The EU at the moment accounts for about 50% of our exports. And so Eurosceptics again say, well, they sell more to us, slightly more, 53% or something. They sell more to us than we sell to them. So frankly, it would be, they need us more than we need them. Actually, our trade, in terms of the percentage of trade that EU countries do with us, it is only 10%. Only 10% of the EU 28's trading weight is directed towards the United Kingdom. So as a negotiating position, I would say it's a pretty feeble negotiating position. I would just conclude on a final point that I think you need to think in the political judgment of the EU as a means to an end. And I'll give you a quote. For us, the EU is a means to an end. Prosperity, stability, the anchor of freedom and democracy, both within Europe and beyond her shores. Not an end in itself. This was said by a man called David Cameron in his famous speech on the EU in January 2013. I think we need to bear that in mind when he makes us go to the polls before 2017. Thank you.
And Phil.
I agree with Philippe that the question we've been posed sets the bar pretty low. I'm going to say not only can the British economy survive leaving the EU, but I think that it will then have a much better prospect for thriving. But my case for leaving has got absolutely nothing to do, with respect to my fellow panellists, with the various estimates of the financial costs and benefits of staying or of leaving. To set expectations, there'll be a lot more of those over the next 6, 12, 18 months or whatever. I am in favour of free movement of goods, capital, labour. Not just with Europe, but with the rest of the world. That's my position. But my economic case for leaving the EU is based on a democratic argument. The democratic argument, and specifically on the matter of the political accountability of economic policy. Fundamentally, the problems I'll be describing, I think, are domestic problems, but they take an external form, namely the European Union as an institution. My argument then relates in fact to why I think all the financial calculations on both sides of the referendum campaign are inherently flawed and meaningless. The true costs and benefits of either decision, staying in or leaving, are simply unquantifiable today because they are contingent on what happens after the referendum result. The economics of either situation, in or out, is not static or predetermined, but depends in particular on the policies that a British government would pursue now and in the period up to the referendum and the period after the referendum. And I'm not just talking about how a British government would, if it stays in, continue to handle the challenges of being a member of the EU, or I'm not saying how it would handle exit negotiations or the establishment of these new free trade agreements that a non-EU Britain would need to enter into. I'm talking more broadly that the economy of the future is much more dependent on what sort of industrial and economic policies the government is implementing than it is on whether Britain is out of any particular trade grouping or any particular economic grouping. And it is on the question of the ability to pursue an appropriate set of economic and industrial policies, which doesn't prove, but I think well illustrates, the democratic case for leaving the EU. Now, we can have very different views, and we do have very different views, I'm sure on the panel, and I'm sure in the audience, as to what are the sort of economic policies that Britain needs to get its economy moving again. Myself, I've written and argued extensively that we need a very radical, transformative type of industrial policy in order to renew the economy. But that's by the by. Any policy, to be effective, is something that requires open and extensive public discussion in society. And it requires full political accountability. If it's just an elitist decision up there to do this, do that, and we see a lot of that at the moment in terms of economic policy, if it's not something that people buy into and take part of, then it's pretty meaningless. And it is that which EU membership restricts, with the European Union, I think, epitomising a contempt for the participation of people in decision-making and the abrogation of democratic politics. Quite simply, what am I arguing is that for as long as we remain in the EU, there'll be less accountability for our policies, including our economic policies, and less scope for changing them. Whereas being outside the EU at least gives us the possibilities for fighting for the sort of policies that we need. Now, this argument for exit, therefore, is not at all, I'm going to stress this, it's not at all based on an assessment of particular EU policies or regulations today, or which may be introduced tomorrow. It's not a matter of anticipating what might go wrong in the future. It's not based on whether they're perceived, or I perceive them, or you perceive them as good or bad policies, but on the principle of the restoring democratic accountability for them. Today, member countries, member peoples, have lost sovereign control over a wide range of areas to appointed elites, whether it's the commissioners in Brussels or the judges in Luxembourg. These are people that national electorates cannot throw out. So, for example, when the European Court of Justice recently ruled, I think it was in September, ruled that the time spent by employees based at home travelling to and from work should be regarded as working time and therefore paid for. Now, we might think that that's a good policy or a bad policy. We might think it's fair or unfair to other workers who do have a fixed location. But the core political point is that as national citizens, there is nothing that we can do to reverse it. We can't enforce political policy accountability by replacing those European Court of Justice judges. Even for Britain, which, being outside the euro, as Philippe made the point, is not today covered by the most invasive forms of Brussels intervention, the EU already influences regional funding, state aid for industry, employment rights and laws, financial regulations, policies for transport, the environment, energy, agriculture and fisheries. I agree they don't set them, I agree with Philippe, but they set the framework for them which national governments may or may not implement. But all of those areas of EU influence have a bearing on national economic policy. So the point I want to stress in ending is that this democratic argument for leaving is not about vilifying nasty Brussels technocrats and bureaucrats over there who are doing all these nasty things to us, in contrast to the nice, cuddly, friendly British politicians who are these saintly Democrats. On the contrary, the source of the problem we have, which I'm discussing, and the source of the derogation of political accountability is located in London. It's located here. It's located in Paris. It's located in Berlin. It's located in the other national capitals, not located in EU headquarters. But it is the European Union as an institution that most sharply expresses this anti-democratic trend. In a sense, I would argue that the European Union's ascendancy as a bureaucratic technocracy is enabled by, I'd even go as far as to say it's been made possible by, it's been caused by, the decay of democratic politics in the various nation states, not least in Britain. And that's the responsibility of the different national political elites. For an illustration, that the biggest problem we have, I think, is at home, even though it takes the external form of the European Union. Look no further than Cameron's secrecy over his wish list for the reforms in the EU. You know, he does not want to engage in a political discussion with the electorate of Britain as to what the reforms are that he's pushing for. Now, he's now, as we know, from the last few days, it's not the pressure of the British people that he's responding to. He's now, because of the different national elites in Europe, are saying, you know, if we're to tango with you, we've got to know what you're going to say. He may well publish that. But the opaqueness and the secrecy with which he's been conducting this reform as a background to a big national referendum, I think exemplifies the undemocratic and anti-political features of the British situation, as well as the relationship between Britain and the EU. So, whether the EU acts as culprit, as it does in some cases, but I think that's probably overstated, or is overstated by a lot of the Eurosceptics, or whether the EU acts as a scapegoat for limiting democratic public engagement, we need to leave it, so that we can start to fight to regain national control and accountability for policies being pursued on our behalf, not least in order to be able to have the sovereign right and possibility of changing economic and industrial policies for the better, which is something our economy sorely needs.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Phil. Now I'm going to welcome Matthew Kirk, who's the Group External Affairs Director for Vodafone.
My apologies again for being late. The exam question for the thing is, can the British economy survive Brexit? Obviously the answer is yes. I think the more interesting question is what the longer-term implications are of remaining part of the European Union or leaving it. And there it seems to me that there are three broad factors that I would like to put into the debate. The first is that I think this century is developing into a century of economies of scale. And you have some natural economies of scale, the United States, Japan, China, India, and so forth. You see some other areas like Southeast Asia where countries are coming together in an arrangement which may develop into something not dissimilar to the European Union, again to create an economy of scale. And the European Union is itself an economy of scale. And I think the digitization that is happening to the economy, the underlying use of digital technology to change the way economies works, itself naturally drives scale. So for the United Kingdom to decide not to be part of an economy of scale would seem a rather perverse decision when the trend of economies is in the opposite direction. The second important reason, I think, is to do with trade relationships, and various other panelists have mentioned this already. Various attempts to model a world trade order have reached their limits fairly quickly, so trade relationships are increasingly based on bilateral negotiations. And in those negotiations, negotiating between two parties who have roughly equal sets of interests creates a better, a stronger agreement than negotiating from weakness towards strength. And so I think there is considerable advantage to the United Kingdom in continuing to be part of Europe's wider trade relationships. Both of those two suggest to me that whatever the result of the referendum and whatever we do after the referendum, whether we vote to leave or vote to stay, we will remain trying to work in a way within a large part of the European economic system. They're our neighbours and our largest trading partner and so forth. And that leads to my third point, which is that I think that we would actually lose sovereignty by leaving. We would lose the ability to shape and influence decisions which will have a profound effect on how our economy would work. Today we are at the table, we're only one voice at the table, but we're a powerful and significant voice at the table. Were we to leave, we would find these decisions being taken at a table at which we were simply not present. We wouldn't practically have the choice whether to follow them or not. We would have to continue the kind of trade relationship that we have with Europe today. So while I believe that the European Union as it is now is far from perfect, and I agree with Phil that it and nation states need to become more democratically accountable, I do not believe that leaving it would be in our long-term interests. I've spent a great deal of my life in France. I was partially educated there and have worked there a lot, and I have many French friends. And they look at our debate in a state of total bemusement. As far as they can see it, we have all of the benefits of being a member of the European Union and have avoided at least half of the obligations. They think that is a perfect position for any country to be in, and one that they wish they were in themselves. Why would we give it up? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Matthew. Right, and finally, Thomas.
Bad position to be in, to be the last, because all the main points have been made before. In the old days of the nuclear theology, we used to call this a decapitating first strike. It leaves me with very little retaliatory forces. In addition, for someone from outside, from Germany, to speak in this debate always smacks of unwanted interference and mind your own business, you might say. So perhaps I will take the cautious route of asking questions of some of my colleague panelists here. Baroness Faulkner reminded us of the British appetite for risk.
Could you just put the microphone a little nearer?
This is what I...
Bring it a bit nearer.
What I... is my feeling after 16 years in Britain, that I do see a great deal of preparedness for risk in this country, quite unlike other countries on the continent. I very nearly said unlike Germany, but that has recently changed because the risk we have taken in Germany vis-à-vis refugees is colossal and totally unquantifiable, and really runs counter to the way we used to evaluate our Chancellor as a prudent woman who more often than not likes to sit on the fence and waits until he has more facts available and then comes to a decision. She is given to rather snap and rash kind of decisions. So it's no longer true that Britain is the only one that goes for risks. I mean, politically, the Labour Party has taken a huge risk recently by appointing Jeremy Corbyn as their new leader, which to me was a refreshing decision to make, and I applauded it in my paper because although we are a conservative paper, I said it's high time there is an opposing view in this country to be taken so that the intellectual and political debate is refreshed by other points of view, and that not everyone in the political culture sings from the same hymn sheet. That is essential in the people that Corbyn speaks for, and I'm slightly digressing from our debate here, are what used to be called in Churchill's days the overlooked millions, because when Churchill was Chancellor and Domestic Secretary, he was in favour of reforming the welfare state. And he coined that phrase, the overlooked millions, and they are being taken up by the present leader of the Labour Party. So risk-taking is in the British gene, and therefore not to worry what might happen if you leave the EU is perhaps not the most deterrent thing to say. In fact, I believe that if the In campaign continues to paint all the negative consequences and the risks attendant to it, I'm reminded of Hamlet's monologue. The fear of something after death keeps us back from making the decision of ending our life. So the fear of what happened to Britain after you exit is used as a template and an argument against leaving. But that in itself, I don't think is going to convince many people. And also, it's been said by Phil, the unpredictability and the unknowability of the future is essential. I'm not convinced by either camp, the in or out economic issues, that they in themselves can stand in 2 or 3 years from now. The world is adrift. The world is changing. We just heard from Matthew that economies of scale demand that you should be part of it. Look at the deal Britain is now entering with China about building a new atomic plant with a huge amount of money involved. I need to be corrected when I say that this was done on an individual basis without very much of EU input. So who's to say that this sort of deal cannot be had in the future? Britain is outside the EU. This is a question I'm putting. Maybe it would be put by the audience as well. I'm therefore, somewhat conflicted about the two arguments that can be turned either way. Yanan Ganesh in the Financial Times recently made a wonderful argument when he said either in or out is not going to change much of history, because if Britain stays in, she will continue to make herself unpopular by demanding democratic accountability, by reminding the EU of the democracy deficit. So she will continue to dissent from some of the basic principles if she stays inside. If she's outside, she will try to be the best of friends with Europe in order to prove that nothing has changed and she remains a European nation. That is an interesting point of view. I leave my argument here to say you have to wait and see. We have to have more facts and figures in. They're very difficult to calculate. Yogi Berra said predictions are very difficult, especially about the future. And on that note, let me just finish.
We're going to go out and ask questions. I'm just going to say one thing, which is, it surprises me that nobody on the panel has mentioned the fact that the EU as a sort of economy as a whole has been doing very badly, and trying to explain why that is the case and whether that actually affects the way we should think about ourselves. So let's just make sure we cover some of the big issues that are going to go along there. So, right, so microphones at the ready, please.
The economic effects of Britain's membership of the EU, in either direction, good or bad, are pretty small. Certainly I've not seen any convincing evidence that our membership of the EU has led to any net trade or investment creation as opposed to simply diversion. And certainly if you look at things on a macro scale, at all the different influences on Britain's net trade position, our membership of the EU is surely overwhelmed by things such as exchange rate movements, trends in domestic demand, trends in offshoring and reshoring, what's going on in China, in EMs, etc., etc. And so, in sum, I think all the sort of fevered talk about the potential negative economic impacts of Brexit are really an attempt, it's basic scaremongering by people who are unwilling or unable to put the political case for continued British membership of the EU.
Mentioned about clout. The EU, as we all know, has been running a German-France axis. That's not going to change. So we don't really have clout within the EU. Quite apart from the difference in economic direction between the EU and us, is the difference between the EU and the rest of the world. As Mr Farage regularly comments, the global economy is expanding, the EU economy is contracting. Indeed, it's bankrupt as well as corrupt. Economic tensions, as obviously demonstrated in Greece and shortly in other countries, is going to kill it alone, never mind the migration crisis that's looming. The other thing is the EU wants to destroy the city. The city provides 25% of all of the government's income. We cannot manage without it. And generally, EU red tape is hindering business. And this is no more apparent than in the prevention of strategic industrial investment. For example, look at Redcar. We need a strategic steel industry for the rest of our manufacturers.
Matt, you say that there's a need for nation states to become more democratically accountable. What you didn't mention was the EU essentially is a political project, and with the euro crisis that we've had, we're just going to be looking at more fiscal harmonisation and political integration, are we not?
I think if we've learned anything over the past century, if nothing else, it's that economies do rise and they do fall. And I think it'd be interesting to hear both the crowd and the panel's views on how we need to not only think of ourselves and what's important for England, but what's important for the economy of Europe. Because in the end, we're not this great, huge power anymore. We need to accept we are a small island, and it is a bit obnoxious at times to think that we're this incredible force that has such a power. And it'd be interesting to know how people think, what people think rather, about our position as a economy within a global economy, rather than just an economy of ourselves.
I wanted to thank Phil particularly, because I think right at the beginning of this debate, I was absolutely astounded that all we were going to talk about was economy. And it's rather like discussing marriage and saying it's a great institution because you can have a house together and you can have a joint account, where in fact it's all about relationships, and it's to do with our relationship with Europe. And my objection is his, I think, is a massive democratic accountability, and that is absolutely vital. We're always talking about it's not democratic, and here we have an organisation which is undemocratic. The other thing is a practical thing. With 28 members and continually saying, let's have another lot, it's completely sclerotic. It sees it doesn't know how to act, and this is now exposed with the migration issue. And so far from being 28 chaps who all get together and have a nice photo opportunity, where they all agree, in fact they don't agree, and and say what you're getting is national interests, which actually is what democratic accountability is all about. And in my view, it will probably implode, and the migration crisis will be the beginning of that implosion.
Great topics that we can now pursue with the panel. So, Kishore, would you like to go on any of them?
There's several, actually, so I'll try and keep... How long have we got? Because that helps.
About a minute and a half.
Minute and a half, okay. Right. The first one about scaremongering, political scaremongering. Actually, I really support the idea of a referendum, and have done. Liberal Democrats completely agree that there should be democratic accountability periodically. So it's not that we can't make a political case. I just made a political case to open with by saying that the economic case is not sufficient of itself. The EU wanting to destroy the city, that was the second one. EU red tape destroying business. I mean, there is nothing further from the truth. Because if you think back, it is this country that had the severest, deepest financial crisis among the EU 28. It is this country that established a Commission on Banking Standards that has recommended higher regulatory burdens than recommended for the Eurozone, where the sovereign debt loop has been pretty ghastly. And it is this country that has negotiated with the EU that we should be allowed to keep our higher standards because we feel they're really necessary because of the complexity and the global role of the City of London. So actually, we're wanting higher standards, we have higher standards, and that's where we are. So the idea that it goes the other way around. It is true, once in a while, financial transaction tax and things like that intrude, and we test that. We go to court where necessary, we won in court when we have gone to court, the European court, the same European court that gave such a bad ruling the other day on something else, but when otherwise we opt out. And in that sense, we are in this hugely privileged role of having said no at the right time, again, political risk and political judgment, having said no at the right time, whereby we have the luxury of being able to do pretty much our own thing while still benefiting from the membership of the club. And so the final thing I would say, the gentleman over there, I was going to slightly say you were young, but I shouldn't do that. It sounds patronising. Small island space in the world. If you look at the size, we may be the 5th largest country, the chairman said. Well, if you take the economy of Japan, China, US, and then you take our economy, we may be the 5th largest, but the difference between being the largest and the 5th largest is a long way. So I would be careful in my use of statistics.
Phil, would you like to comment on anything particular?
Yes, happy to. The issue of trade is the main point that's been put forward to say that there would be a cost of leaving the European Union. I am in favour of free trade, right? Not just with Europe, but globally. I'd like to see free trade. But I have to say that trade is not the most important thing when it comes to economic prosperity. You can have free trade agreements with everywhere in the world. If you've got a uncompetitive, unproductive economy, you're not going to be able to export into those countries. There is a much bigger problem than who we have access to trade or which trading agreement we have or not, which is that productivity has been flat for the last 8 years, and that there's been too little investment to actually create the dynamic which would allow Britain to be exporting more into Germany, more into China, more into America, more into any other part of the world. And what it is that's getting in the way of the ability to restructure the economy here takes us to not the sort of economic question of Europe, but to the political question. And the EU, we're talking about, is a political institution. I want to be part of Europe, and I think at the moment the EU is the biggest barrier to being part of Europe and to being a successful part of Europe. It is that which is undermining, not through external intervention. I'm not arguing there's too much regulation coming from Brussels. That's not my argument. What I'm saying is that national politicians, particularly the British elite, has been using the EU as a way of avoiding taking political responsibility for policies in general, and in particular for economic policy. When it comes to the most important political trend of the last sort of 20 years has been this what I call this depoliticisation, this avoidance of political responsibility, and this tendency to outsource authority and responsibility to other non-elected parties and groups and institutions. We saw the Labour Party did it with outsourcing monetary policy to the Bank of England, a general trend across the Western world. We see it last week, 2 weeks ago, with the outsourcing of infrastructure policy to an independent National Infrastructure Commission. Everything is outsourced away from politics, which I think is the biggest problem we have, because it disengages people from actually doing things which can actually change things for the better. And the most extreme form of that outsourcing, which we've seen, has been to Brussels, has been precisely to say, we can't do this, or we can do that, or whatever, it's down to Brussels has told us to do that. Just to finish with an example, you raised the red car closure confirmed in the last couple of weeks. The important thing to me about the red car closure and the statements made by government ministers when they said there's nothing we can do because of the EU is not to look at those state aid rules which were being used by the government ministers to say that there's nothing they can do to help restructure the economy. The point was the fact that they claimed an avoidance of being able to do anything by blaming the EU. The EU exists as an alibi, as a mechanism by which national elites, not just British elites, but in Germany, in France, all across Europe, it's a mechanism by which national elites can avoid their responsibility by passing the buck on to the EU. Okay. And that's why I'm against the EU, because it expresses that, epitomises that tendency.
Thank you, Phil. And Philippe?
Well, most of your points, Phil, are basically a critique of Britain's economy and British policymakers. And you think that the EU is an alibi for the failings of British policymakers. Now, if your analysis is correct, why don't you think that if we left the EU, they wouldn't find another alibi? Exactly. What mechanism do you think is going to bring about the change you think is desirable and necessary? I agree with some of the points that you make. I think that we need more democratic accountability in Britain. We need more democratic accountability in the EU. The EU itself needs reform. I don't see how leaving the EU would make us better off, and I don't see how leaving the EU would achieve the kind of political change that you want, and I don't see why you can't lobby for the kind of political change you want to see while remaining in the EU. I think actually it's a bit of a red herring.
Okay, thank you. And briefly, Matthew, I'm going to come to you later, Thomas.
Thank you. If I could quickly address three of the points that came from the floor. First of all, the migration crisis, and I'd agree that neither this country nor the EU has handled the migration crisis particularly well. But I do wonder what it would have been like if there had been no EU framework within which to handle it, with individual states just doing their own thing. I think we would have found it much harder. Secondly, the question over here, I think, on political accountability and integration, I think is a very interesting one. Where the UK sits in the EU at the moment is not one that will particularly affect us, because the drive for greater integration will come through the Eurozone. At the moment you have within the EU a slightly schizophrenic structure with the European Parliament on the one hand, a direct democracy body which I think many people would argue doesn't work particularly well and is not particularly representative because it has lowered suffrage in every country except Luxembourg, where voting is compulsory. And then you have national democracy reflected through national representation in the Council of Ministers. And I think at some stage the Eurozone will have to decide which model it's going to go for, and I think that will be a very difficult debate, but not, as I say, one which will have a particular implication for the UK. And finally, on the question of giving up sovereignty, which underlies a great deal of the debate. I spent the first 25 years of my career as a diplomat. I negotiated a number of treaties and I worked with many. This country has thousands of treaties to which it is bound. Every time you enter into a treaty, you limit your sovereignty. It's something nations are doing the entire time, and you always have the ability to decide to reverse that reduction of your sovereignty if you think it would be to your advantage to do so. The referendum gives an opportunity to have that debate in the UK, and I think the debate is a good thing. But to project the EU as the only area in which we are giving up sovereignty is simply wrong. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to go out for questions.
The alibi question is important. If you look at the immigration issue, you can see how that's been extremely damaging over the last 10, 15 years. The last Labour government operated an effective open door policy, but without engaging in a public debate in this country as to why that would be a good idea. The consequence of that was the rise of UKIP and 4 million people voting in the last election for UKIP, pretty much simply because of the immigration issue. And if it weren't for the quirks of the British political system, we'd have 60 or 70 UKIP MPs in the House of Parliament. And it isn't simply about the consequence in terms of the rise of populist movements, which are happening all over Europe, but the centrifugal character now of the EU, that as the centre, the people who are committed to ever closer union become more and more convinced. They're throwing away and repelling larger and larger numbers of people from the concept of a united Europe itself. It's extremely damaging and over the long term, and I fear that Germany is only just about to begin to experience that process themselves, because the same thing happened there, is that policy of effective open door to refugees was not something which was not an argument that had been won with the German people. And similarly, the EU's imposition of refugee quotas on unwilling East European countries is also going to have unfortunate political consequences. So, you can't separate the economics from the politics in this. If you have an unstable political union, an unpopular political union, a resentful and sullen population of Europeans, you cannot have an effective economic union.
Thank you very much.
If TTIP negotiations were to succeed and Brexit happened, what negotiating power do you think the UK will have to form a similar deal with the US? And what would the cost be of being left out of the TTIP?
Thank you.
How useful a referendum would be in choosing whether the UK leaves the EU or England leaves the EU, considering how this is a highly emotional issue, sort of which the public might view in a quite short-term view and not consider the long-term complex issues behind it.
You have to come to a few more debates like this, aren't they?
The EU has not produced its accounts in over 20 years. We joined a Hanseatic League, not the Fourth Reich, and I have found a reference to the EU in Mein Kampf. There are over 100,000 pages of regulations out of the EU, of which Norway only has to follow a few. But the EU extends its interference beyond trade. It interferes in daily life, in local councils, in vacuum cleaners, and stops us vaccinating cattle. The free movement of people, my friends and relations of different nationalities, never had a problem. Jobs never affected my work in defence and telecoms, but I can't run a company under EU regs. Unfortunately, nothing of any use has come out of Brussels since the sprout. But how can the panel defend the most evil export from the EU, and that's VAT, the tax that's paid by little people on just about everything?
Okay, very interesting. Thank you very much.
So I just want to agree with the fact that I think immigration is healthy and I think it is necessary. I think it is a good thing, whether you're a skilled or an unskilled worker. But I do wonder if the panel could demystify the idea that perhaps accepting workers who are willing to accept a wage that is, for them, relatively high, is it that possible that is keeping our wages lower?
Thank you very much. Well, let's come back to the panel on a few of those issues. Thomas, would you like to?
I think flexibility is the issue here at the heart of all this. If you remain in the EU, you have enough flexibility to do your own thing, as it were, outside EU regulations. I remind you of the Lisbon Agenda in the year 2000, when the EU determined that by the next decade they will have overtaken America and there will be the most far-reaching and flexible congregation of states. It didn't happen, as we know. Lots of EU countries have become more centralized and more sclerotic in their economic performance, whereas Britain has thrived and become a more forward-looking and a more successful economy. And this also applies to the idea of having clout. What is there to be gained from having clout in an economy on the continent which is lagging behind the forward mobility of the British economy? That doesn't sound very convincing. And the flexibility argument, now the chicken are really coming home to roost. Whether you are allowed to take exceptions to the general idea of free movement in Europe, full stop, without any conditions apply to it. I think Germany, as it was mentioned before, is coming to that very point, fork in the road. We will have to think of conditions to apply in order to receive a free movement of people. That applies to member states. You have to be allowed to make conditions on the kind of immigrants you need, except of just opening the door, as it were, without any considerations. When we all hit harder times, you will soon see that the principles are good for nothing unless you can do something to calibrate your response to your actual needs. I was reminded, I don't know who said it the other day, if Turkey becomes a member of the EU, because that's probably the only way the Germans can negotiate a Turkish agreement to stop the flow of migrants in their country, in return will allow you to become a member of the EU more quickly. That means another 95 million people having free movement in Europe. I mean, this may be a scary scenario. I don't think we will get there in a hurry. But the principle remains, you have to have flexibility in order to deal with free movement in Europe. And that is a problem that Cameron is going to encounter, whether he's going to negotiate that or not. Not to belong to the ever closer union, I think we will let Britain get away with that. She's not an ever closer anyway, because she doesn't belong to the Eurozone, and she doesn't belong to the ever closer integration that will have to happen in that Eurozone. But the flexibility on immigration is a crucial point, and that impinges on the sovereignty that you have to be able to choose what kind of immigration you want and what kind of jobs you want, and not just be imposed upon you the general principle of unlimited freedom of movement. I don't think in the current state of the world that can be left to survive, that principle.
Okay, thank you. Kishwa?
I want to give that the comment by the gentleman who spoke first about the alibi being important and democracy and the rise of UKIP and so on. You know, that's terribly important. But I think that what you need to think about when you go to vote in this referendum is whether you throw out, as I think Harold Wilson said, 1,000 years of history, whether you throw out the entire British constitutional structure by wanting a change. I don't think that'll happen. You're going to be stuck with the same old, which, alas, I represent. So maybe I can say that. But there are some pretty profound questions to do with democracy. I mean, will Scotland be part of the United Kingdom? That is supposedly the price we will pay if we decide to exit. I'm not entirely clear it'll happen, but it could well happen. So I go back to the risk. These are political risks, political judgments, and we cannot know the answer. But I did want to pick up one or two comments because I chair the Financial Affairs Committee of the House of Lords. One or two points on that issue of regulation. We have, in this country, a record of something called gold plating. So the EU agrees something, and what Whitehall does is add in a couple of layers of extra regulation that civil servants had on the top shelf that they pull off and say, oh, this is a good opportunity. So, for example, one tangible example was that we had higher climate change rules, I gave you the other ones earlier, than were required by Europe. We did that because the public democratically had elected a government that believed that was important. So if you really want democracy, you've got to live with the democratic outcome of what you want. The OECD says that the UK has some of the least product market regulation in the world, and the evidence on the whole shows that our burden of regulation is actually rather lower than you would expect for a developed country.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to insert a couple of things for people to think about at this point. One is to go back to this point of the failure of the EU, which I don't think we really are talking about enough. It may not necessarily matter for the actual argument about Brexit, but it's quite important to understand. And this is the way of illustrating it. In 1980, there were 9 members of the EU, and they represented 30% of global output. In 2015, there are 28. And they represent 17% of global output, just to give a flavour of what's happened over the last 30 or 40 years. And it's possible that our focus was originally on the EU for good reason, and maybe one of the arguments will be that we should look at the opportunities in these small, I emphasise, countries doing quite well, Far East, in other places. They're not all big countries. So I throw that in. And the second thing, on the reform point, so people have mentioned reform is necessary. Philippe mentioned it. He's going to come back on it, I know, because I'm going to say what they are, because it's not a secret what the reform agenda of the Tory government is. They have said, and he said this in his Bloomberg speech, competitiveness and regulation, that's economic, that's got to change, he said. And that's on the agenda to discuss. Sovereignty and competences, which is the degree to which we make our own decisions, obviously. New and clearer relationship with the Eurozone. Clearly, it's got to be a change at some point, if not now, some point. And fourthly, the immigration issues which we touched on, which is that something is going to change on the immigration and the rules around that, even if it's only on the welfare side. So it is clear the main areas, and if anybody's got any comments on whether those are good things or bad things, then we'd like to hear them. Equally, I'd like to hear if anybody's got any views on the position of the EU as it is as a whole. Philippe, you mentioned reform is important, so do you go along that these are the reforms that are necessary?
Well, I'm just saying that when you get to a chance to vote in 2016 or 2017, you're not going to be voting on whatever you hope the EU might be versus whatever you hope the UK might be outside. You're going to be voting on what is the EU like now and what is it likely to be outside. And, you know, it's very easy to project onto a world outside the EU whatever your fantasy or utopia of what your ideal society would be. And the reality is that's most likely not going to come to pass. So, you know, looking at the EU warts and all, you're going to find lots of warts. They're going to have lots of things you dislike about Britain. You're going to have lots of things you dislike about the EU. And you say, wouldn't it be better if it was different? Yes, I would agree with lots of things. It would be nice to have for them to be different, both about Britain and about the EU. But the realistic question you need to ask is leaving the EU really going to achieve the desirable changes that you want to see? And I think in almost every case, the answer will be no.
Have you got any particular reforms in mind that you'd think are good? I accept your warts point. What reforms would you like to see happen?
In terms of the EU?
Yes.
I'd like to have a genuine single market in services. I'd like to open up, the EU would welcome more countries to the east and eventually to the south. I think we need to make the EU more democratic. By reinforcing making the Parliament a proper Parliament, making sure the Council takes decisions openly rather than secret, those kinds of things, a whole host of different things.
I hope they're on the agenda of the discussions.
No, they're not.
They're not on the agenda. Kishore assures us they're not. She's probably going to know.
Further enlargement is not only not on the UK agenda, it is not on the rest of the EU's agenda. The last thing the EU needs now is more enlargement. I accept that the public is more concerned about welfare and benefit tourism, as it's called, restricting access of people who arrive here to benefits until they've contributed to the system, and I completely agree with that. I think that's fair. But I think the single most important one that the Prime Minister is on pretty tricky ground about is that profound question, other speakers have touched on it, of what happens as the Eurozone moves forward to further political, fiscal, economic integration, and what happens to the outs. At the moment, there are only 2 outs, well, Sweden now as well, 3 outs, that have declared that Denmark and the UK have got opt-outs, but Sweden also has voted not to go in. But the others are on a track to go in. And I think a great success would be if the Prime Minister could get some very clear legislative boundaries for the Eurozone not caucusing against the interests of, for example, the United Kingdom, where 41% of our trade with the EU in services is represented by the UK's financial services sector. We are sitting here in the City of London. This is the EU's biggest financial services sector, as well as other services that hang on the back of financial services, law, other corporate services. If the Eurozone starts caucusing against the interests of the city, or if the Eurozone starts bringing in, using qualified majority voting as they did on European Stability Fund, it's getting a bit technical, to do a bailout for Greece, which they shouldn't have done, and we've now got a guarantee that they won't do it again. Those are the things that are really difficult. And if we can succeed on that, then I would applaud the renegotiation.
I think sovereignty's been mystified, or rather confused, as to what sovereignty is. Sovereignty means being able to make your own decisions as a political unit. We happen to be. There are lots of problems with national democracy. I've got a lot of criticisms of national democracy. I've got a lot of criticism with even the form of referendum. But the reality at the moment is that the nation state is the best form of democracy which exists at the moment. We've got to make it work better than it is at the moment. Sovereignty is not about entering into trade agreements. It's not about entering into treaties, right? Because, as Matthew was saying, sovereignty is about being able to control your destiny. Now, you can enter into a trade agreement, and then you can decide to leave that trade agreement. You can enter into the EU, and as may happen in this case, after the referendum, it may leave the EU. That is itself is not about the abrogation of sovereignty, because the abrogation of sovereignty is when you're not able to make decisions about your policies yourself. But that's the problem with being within the EU. Sovereignty is about control. The late Tony Benn made that succinct point about when you meet a powerful person, ask them a couple of questions. One, who are you accountable to? And secondly, how can I get rid of you? And if you can't get rid of the people, and you can't get rid of the judges, there is a mechanism through Parliament. There is a mechanism through Parliament to get rid of the commissioners. Well, judges which are playing a political role at the moment and actually making the law is not the sort of judge that I want to see. That at the moment we have a situation that European Court of Justice judges are actually not just assessing what the law is, if people are breaking the law, they are making up the law and developing the law at the moment. If I may continue, sovereignty is also not about closing yourself off from the world, right? Sovereignty is about making decisions about what your relationship to the rest of the world is. Sovereignty is not inconsistent with free borders for migrants or free borders for trade. I'm in favour of both. I'm in favour of both winning back, securing back sovereignty for people in this nation and in other nations to be able to make decisions themselves. I will argue that those decisions should be about opening the borders, that those decisions should be about arguing for free trade and all sorts of other things. But sovereignty then is what, to me, is the issue of not being able to get rid of people and not being able to get rid of the people who are making decisions about our life. From that, I'm grateful for Philippe for raising the point that he thinks I'm arguing a red herring. Of course, I'm not arguing that simply a no vote in the referendum is going to resolve all the problems of the lack of democratic accountability in Britain. Of course not. What I'm saying, and what I think in your good intentions to reform the EU in a democratic direction, I think what you underestimate is the extent to which the EU exemplifies, entrenches the anti-democratic trend. It's not something which is moving in the right direction, right? Every opportunity, the EU elite expresses their contempt for people. Look at the parliamentary elections last year. When the parliamentary elections last year took place, the discussion from the Euro elite was about why did so many stupid people vote for the National Front, France Nationale, or so many stupid people vote for UKIP and so on. Okay. So the point about the direction of change, I respect that you want to see a reform, but the institutionalization of anti-democracy in the EU is what makes it a suitable focus for fighting to restore democracy through arguing against this institution. And that's a way of actually making the case and developing the case to be able to create democracy, not just in Britain, but across Europe.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we'll come back to the other members of the panel, but first I want to go out.
I think any kind of meaningful reform of the EU would mean no EU, because those are the kind of things I object to. I just don't see the European Parliament as even being like a pretend democratic institution. It's not even a beard or a merkin, you know. It's not covering or doing anything. Nobody votes for it and nobody likes it. All the decisions that are made in Europe are not really made by the European Parliament. They just rubber stamp them. So if you have basically some unelected officials, elites from all of the different countries with a basically different view of how Europe should go to what people in England and Scotland, Ireland, Wales have, then I do not see why should we want to be part of that particular project. I think it would be lovely to have a completely open Europe where we're all together. Absolutely lovely. But I see the European Union as one of the biggest barriers towards that. It's the thing that Europe at the moment, to most British people, is not something that they're part of. I know that younger people feel very, very much different to all the older people, but nobody just really wants to get involved at all in the monetary or political union that is going to come as a result of the monetary union that they've got. You can see the problems that they have when they don't unify and do all things all together. They can't agree with each other. I am a very left-wing kind of English person who just does not want to be involved with any of that. Perhaps it's a generational thing, but the youngsters all seem to believe that by somehow being in a really undemocratic European Union, we are marching towards something progressive, that it will somehow reform itself. It's absolutely not going to. Look how much more powerful it gets every time something goes wrong. If this was any kind of democratic or any kind of organisation that took any notice of what anyone else says at all, something that went that wrong that much, everyone would have been fired. Instead, they just get only more powerful.
Okay, thank you.
When we are talking about free movement, we are talking about tourism and about people that are paying taxes in the UK, but we are forgetting about all the sharing knowledge we will lose and all the talent we were left behind. Like in my case, I'm part of a master program sponsored by the European Union. We are 75 people that came from all over the world, and we studied 1 year in Denmark and 1 year in the UK. And guess what? The people from the UA pay half of the fees. We pay 400 euros for studying in the best university in UK. We also have several benefits. We have a grant, and we don't have to deal with visa problems. And unfortunately, some people from my program, from China, Morocco, Russia, they couldn't make it this year because they have some barriers because of the visa. So imagine now it's hard. Imagine if you are out of the European Union, all the talent you were left behind.
For the last 70 years, there hasn't been a major land war in Europe. That is the longest consecutive period of time in the whole of history. And you can go back 5,000 years. 70 years, the longest period of time without a major land war in Europe. And for the vast majority of that time, the European project has been in existence in some form or other. And there is a strong reason to suggest that those two facts are connected. And the point I want to make is, in a sense, a slight reversal. It is not, would Britain be better off after Brexit, but would Europe be better off after Brexit? And what would the impact be on the European situation as a whole? Because whatever we think about the British situation, I think it is in our interests that Europe is a strong place. And I think part of our thinking about a referendum in Britain should be not only its impact on Britain, but its impact on Europe.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very good point. I'm not saying that's going to be a major issue in the Brexit discussion nearer the time, but it is worth thinking about what the impact on the EU would be of Brexit, and arguably the very fact that there's a sort of debate like this and a referendum coming could have an impact on the way the EU might want to treat us in future, which, as someone was pointing out, I think Matthew, that it's all about relationships. They may not be quite so good after that if you have these sort of rows, should we say. So I'm going to come back to the panel. Matthew, do you want to pick up anything that's gone on recently?
Thank you. 3 very quick points. First of all, the interesting question we were asked a while ago about immigration and low wages, which I think is a really interesting and very difficult topic to get to the bottom of. I think there are many things that put pressure on wages. Competition within an economy does. Immigrants who have lower expectations of wages can do too. So does globalization, and so does the ability to move where work is done around the world, and to move some aspects of work to lower wage economies. To me, the right answer to this, which I think is one that every European country could do an awful lot better, is not so much to try to reduce the pressure on wages, but to try to raise the level of skills. The higher skills you have, the higher wages you can command. And there is no doubt that the sort of work that higher skilled labour does is also safer, cleaner, and so forth. So you move your economy into a higher plane. I wanted also to touch very quickly on two other things. One, Peter, was your comment about the decline in relative strength of the EU economy. This has been very largely brought out by hundreds of millions of people in China and India being brought out of absolute poverty, which I would say is a very good thing indeed for them, for the world, and for Europe, because it expands the markets that we can address. So I'm all in favour of people in the rest of the world getting richer, even if that means that Europe relatively is poorer. And finally, Phil's points on sovereignty. My point about sovereignty was a very simple one, that every time you enter into a treaty, you constrain your sovereignty in some way. That's what treaties do. And the treaties in the European Union are no different to any other treaties. In 1389, we entered a treaty with Portugal, which is still in force, which constrains some of the things that we can do in our relationship with Portugal, including invading it. Now, you might argue that's a very good thing. I would say it is, and that's probably why the treaty is still in force. But every treaty, including now the European Union Treaty, was rather rare in not having exit provisions, but it does now have exit provisions. So every treaty has the ability for you to take back your sovereignty. So there isn't something unique about the European Union in removing sovereignty. That was my point. Every treaty does. If you look at the way that the NATO treaty constrains our sovereignty and constrains us to take some of the most difficult decisions that you can take, decisions to send soldiers to fight and die, in Article 5 of the NATO treaty. If you look at Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter and the way in which that constrains the international behaviour of states, these can be very profound things. They're entered into, ratified by parliaments, and in most cases you can withdraw from them. The question is, what are the implications of withdrawing from it? Your sovereignty is always retrievable, but a voluntary constraining of sovereignty is a necessary part of international relations.
Okay. Thank you very much. Very last comments now we're into. Thomas, do you want anything to round up?
Yeah, this issue about what has kept the peace in Europe, I totally agree with this gentleman's argument, except to say it's only half the story. The other half is NATO. The reason why we've kept the peace in Europe and been able to deter the old Soviet Union, now Russia, has been because America was present on our soils and guaranteed the atomic sort of coverage through it. Europeans would have been daft to, after 2 world wars, to think of ever being at each other's throats again. Now that we have recovered our strengths, we might think there might be new conflicts. But the basic lack of a conflict or absence of a conflict has been due to the fact that, as Lord Ismay once famously said in 1949, the reason for NATO was to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. Now, that has not quite worked out to our benefit and everyone else's, but NATO is an essential part. But the peace argument has, I think, somewhat run its course, because we are engaged in peaceful activity, but that doesn't solve our issue. We need to feel we have enough flexibility to look after our own good. And that's the point that I'm trying to make, and that I haven't been quite convinced by the argument that it will safeguard the flexibility, more flexibility than Britain needs. She can do her own. I don't believe also that all the companies and international companies will relocate once Britain leaves the EU. There's been no argument to be made for that. And I'm thinking that unlike what you said quite convincingly and eloquently about the relationship with the Central European Euro member states, I do believe that migration is an essential aspect, and I think a lot of it rides on how you solve this and how Cameron gets away from the negotiating table in receiving enough individual flexibility for Britain.
Thank you very much. Philippe, we'll come back on. Anything?
Yeah, first on democracy. I mean, I think both Britain and the EU need to be more democratic. But there's a model of a country within the EU which is much more democratic, which shows that it's not the EU that's the constraint, and that's Sweden. You see that Swedish ministers are much more open and accountable for the decisions they take in Brussels. You see that the Europe Committee in the Swedish Parliament holds to account what they do much more effectively than our own Parliament does. You see that the democratic system in Sweden in general operates in a much more open and transparent and accountable way than our own does, which tells you that the real flaws that you identify, Phil, lie in Britain, not primarily in Europe. Secondly, the gentleman over there who talked about barriers to openness. I mean, again, I agree that the EU could be much more open. But far from being a barrier to open, it is spread openness. It's thanks to the EU that we had the deregulation of air travel, which gave us EasyJet and Ryanair, which means that suddenly going abroad has been democratized. It's thanks to the EU that we have freedom of movement from Lithuania to Liverpool and from London to Lisbon. And what a fantastic thing that is. It's thanks to the EU that we have the Erasmus programme so that British students and foreign students can go study abroad. So British people can go work abroad. So British pensioners can go retire in Spain and benefit from free healthcare. And think a bit about what the potential consequences of leaving might be. There will be a second referendum in Scotland, and it's quite probable that Scotland would vote to leave. There would certainly be an external EU border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which many people in Ireland find profoundly worrying. If there is a vote to leave, it will not be a vote in favour of people like Phil. It will be a vote in favour primarily of people like Nigel Farage, which means actually it will be a vote primarily for pulling up the drawbridge, for closing the borders, for saying, stop the world, I want to get off. And that's something that I want no part of.
I agree with Philippe. The problems are mainly, the anti-democratic trends that we're seeing are mainly national. And of course there are different ways in which countries can negotiate those democratic deficiencies. My argument is that the EU institutionalizes that. My argument is the EU is the main form in which the anti-democratic tendencies are expressed. And it's not the case, to reiterate, that leaving the EU will solve everything, will solve democratic accountability, will create, the world that me and Philippe both want to see of open borders, but it will be a sign that we are taking matters into our own hands. It would be a sign by voting no that we are beginning to fight to change the world for a better place. It'll be a sign of saying that we're not prepared to lose control or accept the abrogation of control to others, but be prepared to do something which is not just in the interest of British people, because to end on the question about what would it mean for Europe, whatever figures are, 2/3, 70% of European people feel estranged from the European institutions, feel that EU has got nothing to say to them. Europeans as well, across the whole, or Europeans within the EU, could take that lead as well from a decision by the British people to vote to leave. A vote to leave then would be a sign of people standing up and beginning to fight again for democracy, not just in Britain, but across Europe, and that would be a progressive thing for Europe as well.
And you got the last word, Kishwa.
Discussion today has highlighted how divided we are as a country about things that we haven't really thought through in the longer term. And I thought the most interesting question, although it's not what we can answer now, was about what Europe will look like and we will look like once we vote to leave, if we so do. And there's a simple point about treaties here. A lot of the stuff that we've talked about today, immigration, guess what? Those European countries that are taking in migrants in large numbers are doing so under a treaty, Article 51 of the Asylum Convention, refugee conventions. So this idea that we, by using Article 50 and walking out, as Phil says, we suddenly become sovereign individuals, autonomous and able to do what we want. Wake up. This is the globalized 21st century. Everything we do is integrated with other things that happen to us, as well as things that we affect in other places. So I ask you to leave on this note. When you're sitting in an Italian restaurant, or when you're planning your next holiday, or when you're flying on Ryanair, or when you're looking at a drug that's manufactured beyond the UK's shores, think about this. Do we have more in common with each other, or do we have more in common with looking just at the UN Security Council, because a lot of it has been about the exercise of power? Do we have more in common with Russia or China? I know which one matters to me more by a long margin. Thank you.
Okay, that'll give us something to think about. Thank you all very much for coming. Can you thank the panel, please?